Welcome to tonight's webinar. This is our September webinar in our series of Michigan beekeeping office hours. So I'm here with Zachary Wong, Megan Milbrath, and Dan Wines. Michigan State University Extension programs are open to everyone. So here's what we have planned for y'all tonight. I'm going to get us started with some announcements and talking about different ways to connect with us. We have a lot of announcements. There's a lot of cool upcoming events. Dan's going to talk about drone eviction and entrance reducers. Megan's going to talk about condensing and ventilating hives. Zach is going to talk about winter feeding. We're all going to talk about Varroa mites, and then we're all going to answer your questions. So I'll get us started here. If you are watching us live, the way you can see any links that we're sharing throughout the webinar is through the chat box. So if you look at your Zoom controls, you should see the chat, and that's where we'll share links that we're mentioning in tonight's webinar. If you're watching the recording on YouTube or on other platforms, you can look at the description box, and that's where we'll include the links that we share throughout the webinar. We posted all of our past office hour webinars from this year on YouTube. The August webinar is up on as well, so if you missed that one, you can watch the recording. And so that's the August Beekeeping Office Hours webinar. And so we're recording tonight. Tonight's webinar will also be posted online as soon as we're done doing the closed captioning. We always like to remind people that a huge resource for beekeepers here in Michigan is our local bee clubs. Michigan has over 30 beekeeping clubs. If you haven't already found your club, you can go to the Michigan Beekeepers Association's website, which is michiganbees.org, and click Michigan Bee Clubs. The Michigan Beekeepers Association is also trying to build up its cutout removal list. So if you are a beekeeper who does cutouts, meaning that you remove honeybee colonies from structures like homes, or if you know someone who is, we'd love to add you to that list. We're getting a lot of calls and requests for people to do cutouts, but we don't have a lot of people on that list right now. And so if you're not already listed, but you have those skills and expertise and interests, please reach out to Michigan Beekeepers Association's newsletter editor and get yourself added to that list. All right, we're super excited to announce that we have a new online course. So it's called Is Beekeeping Right for Me? It's free, it's self-paced. I know a lot of you who are watching tonight are already beekeepers, but maybe you have people you know who are thinking about getting started with beekeeping, or maybe you're watching and you're not yet a beekeeper and you're just trying to learn as much as you can before you get started. So this is an online course that goes through introducing you to beekeeping, the different considerations in terms of time, financial, physical demands in the bee yard, and then offers a lot of different ways to help honeybees and all pollinators. All right, our website is pollinators.msu.edu, and on that page, you'll find our events. So our events page has a list of upcoming events, and so I'll share some of those highlights with you. So one is that there is a new exhibit at the MSU library, at the main library, on beekeeping. It's called Building a Buzz, A History of Beekeeping in the United States. It just opened last week, and it has a lot of items and artifacts that were donated by Dr. Roger Hoopengardner's family from his collection. So that's a cool thing to check out. I wasn't able to get there last week, so I can't actually speak to it, but it's something that we're all excited to go visit. Dr. Megan Milbrath and Dr. Peter Fowler are also going to do an office hours style webinar next month on Thursday, October 12th at 7 p.m. on European foulbrood. So if you have European foulbrood questions, you can bring them to that webinar. And then we're also partnering with the Michigan Beekeepers Association to do some pre-conference webinars. So these are going to be additional webinars in preparation of the in-person conference. So we'll have a presentation by Sibyl Preston on Monday, October 2nd at 7 p.m. on the Maryland Department of Agriculture's Apiary Inspection Service, how human and dogs are keeping Maryland honeybees healthy. So I think that a lot of you have gathered from watching our webinars that we have a lot of fans of dogs in this group. And so if you like dogs and you like bees, this is going to be a great webinar for you to watch. It's only going to be live. It's not going to be recorded. So you'll have to make sure that you join us live for that one. And then our other pre-conference webinar is called Top Tips for Northern Beekeepers. This will be by Dr. Katie Lee, who is at the University of Minnesota. The webinar will be on Wednesday, October 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern. Again, this one will also not be recorded. It will just be live. And Dr. Katie Lee is the keynote speaker for the Michigan Beekeepers Association's fall conference. So you'll get to see a presentation from her ahead of time in preparation for the live conference. So these pre-conference webinars are offered to everyone for free, but the Michigan Beekeepers Association is asking people to consider making a donation to them or to become a member of the organization. And it's going to be the same webinar link that we use for the Michigan State University office hours. So if you're watching tonight live, you already have the link. You'll get automatic reminders before those pre-conference webinars take place. So if you're signed up and watching tonight, you're also signed up for the pre-conference webinars. All right, and then I also want to just make sure everyone knows that our fall conference is going to be in Clare, Michigan on Saturday, October 21st. Last time I checked, registration isn't open yet, but it will be posted to Michigan Beekeepers Association's website when it opens up. So some highlights include Dr. Katie Lee presenting on Long Live the Queen, ? Economics of queen replacement. Peggy Garnes is going to talk on overwintering nukes. There's going to be a business meeting for the MBA and a lot more. So this is going to be a great time to connect with other beekeepers in person. And then also just to think about that upcoming business meeting and the elections that the Michigan Beekeepers Association is having. So this is a volunteer-run organization. You can absolutely consider getting involved. You can do so by nominating yourself or someone else for a position. You can join a committee. There's lots of committees that do work in terms of policy or fundraising, communications, conference planning, all kinds of things. And so you can reach out to the Michigan Beekeepers Association if you want more information on how to get involved. All right, so hopefully you're signed up for our newsletter digest. You can sign up by going to the website and clicking Stay Connected. And there you'll find an option to sign up for our newsletter, which is the Pollinators and Pollination News Digest through MSU Extension News. All right, if you are watching live, we hope that you ask questions throughout the webinar tonight. You can do so by putting your question into the Q&A box of the Zoom controls. And then, as you hopefully know, between webinars, or if you have other questions that come up, you can feel free to use our Ask Extension form, which is posted on our website, pollinators.msu.edu/questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Dan, who's going to talk about all things beehive entrances, so drone eviction and entrance producers.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So just to start, these topics kind of go together because, again, we're looking at the entrance, and the first thing I thought, we should want to talk about is drone eviction. Because where we're at in Michigan, it is that time of year. Maybe it's been that time of year for a few weeks. But I was just talking to a researcher out in Oregon, and he'd gotten a really panicked phone call from a beekeeper thinking bees had been poisoned. There's all these dead bees out in front of the colony. What's going on? Somebody poisoned my bees. He said, well, send me some pictures. What are you seeing? And send him some pictures, and it was like 95% drones. And he said, oh, well, it's early September. We've been in dearth for quite a while. This is naturally what happens. So I just wanted to mention drone eviction because it's that time of year as you're out around your colonies. It's totally normal that you're going to start seeing, if you haven't already, kind of piles of dozens, hundreds of drones laying out in front of colonies. Maybe they're on landing board. But if you don't have a lot of long grass or if you've got kind of bare soil or something like that in front of the colony, it can be pretty startling to see. Once you start seeing piles of them, you look closer, you find out they're all drones. And so what's happening is this is pretty seasonally predictable. Drones are pretty expensive for a colony. There's a lot of investment in putting the resources into raising them because they're important to carry on the colony's genetics. They are worth investment in certain times of the year. But right now, that window is kind of closing. Colonies aren't in reproduction mode. There's an oddball late swarm, always one or two. But generally speaking, colonies are not in reproduction mode this time of year. So they're starting to view drones as they're more expensive than they're worth. We're not going to carry these guys all through the winter. We'll make new drones in the spring. So what happens is the workers, first you'll see, if you're examining colonies going through frame by frame, they get pushed out to the perimeter. Sometimes if you tip your boxes forward, you'll see them all on the bottom board. It'll be like almost all drones on the bottom. Or if you're pulling frames and you start by pulling an outside frame or next to the outside kind of perimeter of the brood nest, you'll see like a disproportionate amount of drones out on those outside frames. So first they kind of get put out to the perimeter, and then they physically get kicked out, actually dragged out by workers. I think there's the next photo has got one where it's like actually a worker is physically evicting a drone. So they do carry them out. And what triggers this, again, in Michigan, I think this is the time of year when we see it. There's been done on it, and it is a lack of foraging. It's a lack of food coming into the hive that's telling, hey, resources are getting scarce. So they start kicking them out of the hive. You see on the right, there's a worker that's actually physically dragging the drone out of the colony. So if you start seeing a bunch of dead drones in your hive and everything else appears to be in order, don't panic. Totally normal this time of year. Or you could see it other times of year if there was a prolonged dearth and the colony started feeling tight on resources and incoming forage, they're going to start dragging the males out. So that's one thing to look for as you're looking at your entrances. We talked about robbing fairly extensively in the last webinar, so I'll point you towards that. If for more in-depth on robbing, what it is, what it looks like, how to prevent it. But just talking about tonight, like reducing the entrance. And so one way you can do that is a robbing screen. Or there are various entrance reducers. But when I'm thinking about putting entrance reducers on, I'm really thinking about like closing down the defendable space that colony has, whether it be from, it could be robbing with like, other colonies or yellow jackets. So sort of our insect pressure, or, but more often when I'm putting an entrance reducer on this time of year, I'm thinking about mammals and little critters that want to get into the hive and cause problems. So our next slide, I think, shows an entrance reducer in place, and we skipped a couple. But an entrance reducer closing down the entrance on a hive. And so that's physically blocking the entrance, and you can supplement that with some hardware cloth. And what we're doing there is trying to keep the mice out. And the shrews out, and I'll talk about in a minute why that is. So the mice typically they're not really predators of the bees. They're just kind of opportunistic. They're scavengers. If you think about what a beehive is out in the environment, it's dry, it's warm, and there's a bunch of food in it. There's protein, there's bits of, there's bee bread and pollen, there's bits of honey, there's, dead bees. So if you're kind of a scavenger in the environment and you find this warm, dry, it's not even just warm, it actually physically generates heat. A beehive's a pretty attractive place to spend the winter if you're a mouse. So as a beekeeper, keeping mice out of the colony, because we remember as we get colder, our colonies are going to cluster up and they're going to move upwards through the winter as they eat into their honey stores. So you're going to end up with a largely empty box down below and clustered bees up on top. Perfect place for a mouse to set up shop for the winter. And they make an awful mess in the bottom of a beehive. It stinks. So trying to reduce that entrance and put some hardware cloth over that entrance will exclude a mouse. 1/2-inch hardware cloth works really well. That'll keep mice out. And this picture we like because this colonies are sitting up on, and don't mind the plywood bottom board, but these colonies are sitting up on cinder blocks. Is a little bit of a hive stand, and you can see the remnants of there's a mouse nest underneath there. So it's, in this case, it's good. It's actually not living inside the colony, chewing holes in our frames and damaging and defecating in the bottom of the hive all winter long. So physically keeping them out is a good thing to do. Also, it's important mice climb very well. So if you have an upper entrance, like we run boxes with auger holes in them, or sometimes I'll put a shim on top if I want to do like a mountain camp feeding, if I want to put some dry sugar on. So if you've got something like that, like that's a 1-inch auger hole, putting a bit of hardware cloth, not forgetting that entrance essentially, because mice will find a way in. So something like that we cover. Also, you kind of notice the bees have their own way of reducing. They will put propolis in here. This has probably got more to do with their preference for ventilation. I mean, a mouse is going to chew through propolis if it wants in, but this is just something, if you peek between that bottom of the box and the bottom board, you'll see they've really closed this entrance down. And again, that's probably got more to do with bee traffic and thermal regulation than it does. I don't think bee brains get the concept of keeping a mouse out, but it is something interesting going on at the entrance you might see this time of year. So they do use propolis in that way. This is another hardware cloth on entrance. So the other photos, all the previous ones prior to this were 1/2 inch hardware cloth. This is 1/2 inch, and that keeps mice, that keeps things out. That's a good size. I would recommend using that. That does the job well. The other photo with the other auger hole in the purple box, this one here, this is 1/4 inch hardware cloth, and it will let bees come and go, and it will keep mice out. The issue I've run into with this, and I used it because that's what I had on hand, is the bees kind of have to wriggle through it. They just barely fit. And what happens there is it pulls their legs back behind them. And if you have pollen foragers coming home, it ends up stripping the pollen off. So if you use this smaller hardware cloth, I found I needed to take it off in the spring because that first spring pollen is really important to the colony, and I didn't want to be stripping it off ending on the landing board. So 1/2 inch is the ideal. 1/4 inch will work if you've got it, but do just be mindful that you may be pulling a little bit of pollen off that colony. So those are the two different sizes that'll work for excluding critters. The shrew, these are where look very similar to a mouse. They've kind of got the long prominent snout there, but where the mice are scavenging, they're just kind of in there opportunistically eating the debris that falls down to the bottom of the hive and taking advantage of the warm place. The shrew is not going to take up residence in the hive. It's a predator of honeybees. It's actually eating them. It's kind of hunting them and eating them. So it's going to live elsewhere, but it's going to, if it learns a beehive as a food source, it's going to come start eating your bees. And how you have shrews, you're not going to see like a mouse nest. That's pretty hard to misdiagnose. But the shrews, they end up eating, sometimes they'll decapitate bees, or they'll just drill in through their thorax, which is the middle segment of, head, thorax, abdomen. It's essentially where the most meat is. It's the bees have their flight muscles there. It's the most protein for the shrews. So they go in and if you have shrew damage, you'll have this really characteristic, the bees are kind of hollowed out. Yeah, you see this circled here, this one where it's got its head, it's got its abdomen, and then you see the thorax between the wings. There's just been a hole drilled into it. So it's very distinct and characteristic of shrews. And so again, this hardware cloth in the entrances will exclude a shrew from coming in periodically and picking off your bees and feeding on them and leaving this very telltale characteristic sign of shrew damage. Now, I did just tell you that's the shrew damage is pretty diagnostic with the thorax. Also, our puppy, who we clearly adore, he did, could be confused for shrew damage with the decapitation and hollowed out thorax, but we like him anyways. So I'll turn it over to Megan. She's going to talk about hive ventilation and condensing hives.
Thanks for setting me up with this super cute Reno pics. All right, so I do see some questions, but we'll maybe go through everything that we have and answer those at the end. So it is kind of a joke that I think I'm doing this topic of condensing and ventilating hives because I think I care the least about it from anybody on the planet, potentially, in terms of how it feels that it makes your hive. So when we're talking about condensing, I'm not using the term of like putting your hive, like condensing it down like we talked about last month. It's talking about whether or not you want something that is on the top of your hive that allows the water to condense on the side. So it's like condensation with water. This is a hive that is overwintering quite fine. So mostly for me, I've been very happy that I've been able to get basically all of my bees through the winter every single year the last few years, except for I always get one that the pygmy shrews get in. And I don't basically do anything to my hives. So I have migratory lids and I just leave them on. I don't tend to wrap. It is boxes outside. And one of the things that we talk about the most is you have to make sure you have an animal that is very well fed with lots of healthy winter bees. And if you have really poor survival, it's not going to be what's happening to the hive. It's going to be what's happening with your animal. So that'll be later in the talk when we start talking about Varroa. That being said, once you've got a hive that's doing really well, you can make some changes that reduce the stress. So this photo that is up here is one of my absolute favorite photos ever. And it's from a 1977 bulletin where from the University of Wisconsin, when they used to have a bee lab there, and they overwintered colonies in screened hives. And this is in Wisconsin, which is colder than most of Michigan. Excuse me. And they did this for 2 years and they overwintered 4 hives like this. And the first year they had these bees out in the wind and they made it all the way through. They had temperature probes in there. The temperatures were the same as the colonies that were in hives without screen, that were just in normal hives. And they were able to maintain the same temperatures. But when a storm came in February, the wind was blowing so hard that it cooled the outside bees so that they fell to the ground. Because when bees get about 28 degrees, they die and they'll get a paralysis and they won't be able to maintain that cluster. So the bees got cold, they fell to the ground, the cluster got too small, and those colonies died. The second year, they overwintered them in these screens, and 2 of the 4 colonies lived, which isn't great survival, but it does show proof of concept that you can keep healthy bees in a very, very terrible climate without putting a ton of attention into the hive. That being said, you can do things that will reduce the stress. Here's a picture from Rusty Burlew, and she shows the infrared. And one of the reasons that I like this photo is it shows that there's very little heat escaping the colony. So you can see the animal, you can see the bright white in the middle, where it's the warmest, and then you can see red, and then you can see yellow, but the hive itself is very cold. So if you're putting a lot of attention into insulating, wrapping, and things like that, then you're not going to be like letting the heat out when you open the lid, just because there isn't that much heat that's actually leaving the hive. And there's a nice analogy that I heard recently from Gary Reuter, where it's kind of like people who are winter camping, in that the tent really adds a lot like the hive is a lot like a tent in that it blocks the wind, but the cluster itself is like a winter camper in a sleeping bag. So like it's still nice for them to have a tent, but that's not really where the most important thing. What they need is that nice insulating layer of bees that's like a sleeping bag. And so you can see, though, it is really important to have most of the insulation on the top of the hive. So Bill Hesbach has some really nice articles like this, and I'll put it into the chat as well, about the condensing colony. And he's the one where I learned that term. And Ann Arbor Group was lucky enough to hear him on Tuesday talk about this. And he talks about, if there is going to be heat escaping, it's going to go up. And what we don't want is to have a lot of moisture that's going to come back down on the bees. So if you are going to put effort into anything, putting insulation on the top, and honestly, snow is a lovely example of what that can be. All right, so I believe this is one of his photos, and you can see, a lot of people are worried about having too much moisture in the hive, but in all honesty, that's not really a thing. And Bill talks about this too, is that a lot of people will say, oh, they think moisture killed their hive or their colony because they'll go into the hive after the colony's dead and it'll look all wet and gross. And that's really an issue of the bees dying, and then it gets all wet and gross. Not that the wet and gross made the bees die. And one thing to keep in mind is that, honeybees are animals. They're respirating a ton, especially when they're working out their muscles and trying to keep warm. And in Michigan, a lot of times our honey is going to crystallize in the hive. And thankfully, bees do not have teeth, right? That would be horrifying. So they really don't have the ability to eat crystallized honey. They have to reliquefy it with water. So having moisture in the hive is not this big, scary, terrible negative that a lot of people talk about. And one of the ways that you can manage that is if you insulate the top of the hive, so that's the warmest, and then the walls are colder. This is where the condensing colony comes in. Then you have the lower temperature on the sides of the hive. And then when the water vapor comes off of your cluster, it's going to condense on the sides of the hive. It'll either be usable for the bees or it'll drip down to the bottom and run out without being a problem. These are photos from where I was in Sweden, and they actually just use, so a lot of people talk about you have to have quilt boxes or moisture boards, or the first thing that has to be above the colony has to be wet. And they actually do a completely different thing because they don't want to hold that moisture right above the cluster. And so their inner covers are what you see here with this just simple piece of plastic. And the plastic was very interesting because it actually collected water on it in big drops, but they didn't tend to fall down, and the bees would actually use the water. But you can see Lotta here is holding a big lid that is pretty well insulated. They did have a lot of insulated boxes. You can see these walls are a little thicker, but they weren't worried about having a something above it. All right, here's another example where they do have an upper entrance. And that is it is a method you can do, or it is a practice to have an upper entrance. It's not something that is necessary, but it's also not something that is bad. So the benefit of having an upper entrance is that, you know, if you do have a lot of slow buildup or a lot of dead bees at the bottom board, it does give the bees another way to get out. The downside to having an upper entrance is that when you pull air through the hive and you have that high ventilation, you're pulling that cold air through. That's making your bees colder, and it's going to make them use more energy and go through more food. So if you can insulate them, keep them, or if you can have it so that there's not a lot of air going through, which sometimes you can use these bee cozies, sometimes your woodenware, if it's nice woodenware, it's enough. If you've got a lot of upper entrances in the corners, which a lot of my equipment often has, then maybe you want to wrap with tar paper. But really the goal is to keep it with not a ton of wood. So here's another version with the bee cozy and an upper entrance. Here's tar paper and an upper entrance at the top, and the lid. Sometimes too, you can set it up so that the lid can block it off, and then you can prop it open for like in the spring when you anticipate them going out and flying. All right, so this is one of my yards. I wrap with tar paper every now and again. And one of the reasons that I do it is that it makes me feel good about doing something for my bees, and also in areas that are pretty windy. So this is a pretty windy site, and I figured out the cost that even if it saved one hive, it's worth the effort because it's so small of effort and small of cost. But it's not something, last year I didn't wrap, the year before I didn't wrap, and I didn't hardly lose any bees. So it's definitely not something that is necessary. One thing to keep in mind is that you don't necessarily want to make the bees warmer in November and December when we're getting these 60-degree days still. So this is maybe something that you're going to do later in the season, but not something that you're going to be going out and doing now. All right, and winter feeding with Zachary.
Hi, so I'm continuing the program about winter feeding. So winter feeding is actually quite different from fall feeding, which will be now. So winter feeding is when you found out the bee cluster has moved way near the top sometime in January or February, or even a cold March. So I have used the FLIR thermography attachment to my cell phone, and if you do it at night or during a cloudy day, you could sort of see, not very reliably, So to see if the colony is alive or where the actual cluster is now moving up. So when you do find the bees are near the top, and there's still a month or two before the bees could fly, and that's when you need to feed. So in Michigan, this means you cannot feed liquid food, so you have to do dry feeding. So this would include dry sugar, candy balls, or winter patties. So one method that's quite popular recently is called mountain camping method, or mountain camp method. So just use a piece of newspaper and use an empty box and put dry sugar there as a pile, fill the box. If you lay down the newspaper all the way inside the box, then you could actually put more sugar there if you think they need that. So the mechanism is that the moisture from the hive, the condensation moves up, get absorbed by the dry sugar. So the sugar actually becomes a cake after a while, maybe after a week or so. So then the bees would chew through the newspaper, and this dry sugar is not going to drop like a hourglass, which would be bad if sugar just comes down. So this method would rely on that the sugar would cake up. Another method is sugar bricks, as shown here. So the sugar are pre-made as a brick in some kind of container. Most place actually you could spray water and wait for a day or two, and then you see the sugar has become caked up, so you can move it as a brick. Then you put them into the colony. And another method, the older method is actually, which not very many people use right now, is called sugar boards. I will give you the link in the chat right now for you to see. That talks about what's the recipe, what it look like, and then basically you just put them on top of colony in a reversed way. So when you pour them, it's facing up. Then when the sugar is cold, condensed, you flip it this way so the bees could access it. So you could keep an eye watching them and replenish more sugar. So in this case here, you would have to lay another piece of newspaper, because you can't just pour dry sugar there. It's going to move down, and bees are not going to go down in the winter. That's one feature of the winter cluster, is if you have sugar, it's dropping through the bee space all the way to the bottom. Bees is going to stay in that cluster because it's too cold. If the bees are moving away from the cluster, they get frozen and they'll be dead. So they're not going to move down, they only move slowly up. So that's why it's important that you have food above them and not below them. So if you don't put newspaper there, then the sugar is going to be below them, and that's wasted. Bees will not be able to access it. So another slide. Okay, so that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. So you've all probably kind of figured out that sometimes with our webinars, we try to share stuff ahead of time. I would say, at least in this part of the state, if we know that hives are light or that they need to be fed, we're still definitely feeding sugar syrup because it's warm enough here for the bees to move the syrup and dry it out. But the winter feeding is important for when it's too cold to feed with syrup. So we're going to wrap up by talking about Varroa mites. So this is a time of year where sometimes we find surprisingly high mite levels. We have experiences from doing monthly Varroa mite checks throughout the season in several yards in Michigan, and even when I worked in Minnesota. And sometimes we find colonies that had low mite levels all throughout the season, while colonies were being managed, and then really high levels in September, or even not until October sometimes. So it is helpful for you, I think, to keep continuing to monitor for Varroa mites with the alcohol wash test. We have a lot of instructions on how to do that, but that will give you some context to kind of understand the health of your bees, and then also to see if the management that you were doing for Varroa mites has been working. So there's a lot of different management considerations for this time of year. One is going to be temperature. So looking at that extended forecast. I know a lot of people have already pulled all their honey supers on, but if you still have honey on to extract, you'd want to consider that and see if the treatment's labeled for use with honey supers. Colony size. So if they're normal, regular size colonies, or if you're trying to work with some smaller colonies, the amount of capped brood you have at this time of year, whether or not you're feeding. So lots of different things to consider. The Varroa treatment labels will have more guidance there. One thing that we'll kind of mention that we do tend to do in, I'd say normally November, December, is an oxalic acid dribble. So this is a solution method with oxalic acid. And remember, oxalic acid is a treatment that's really good when there's little or no sealed brood in the hive. And so we oftentimes do this treatment in the late fall when we don't expect sealed brood to be in the hives, when all of the Varroa mites that are in that colony are exposed on adult bees. And it's a nice treatment to try to just kill any of the, or as many mites that we can that are still remaining on that honeybee cluster. So by this time, when we're doing the oxalic acid treatment, we hope that our mite levels are already really low. We're trying to manage mites throughout the season so that the virus levels don't get high, and so that all the winter bees develop under really healthy conditions. But it's nice to use this to try to kill any remaining mites to hopefully lower the overall mite load that comes through the winter into the spring. And so this is a treatment where it works nicely when the bees are loosely clustered. So you can see here, we had a beekeeper just split the boxes. So we're looking in between the boxes, and then the label will explain how to do it. But basically you're dribbling some of the oxalic acid solution. So it's oxalic acid mixed with sugar syrup onto the bees. I know there's sometimes beekeepers who get really nervous about opening up hives when bees are loosely clustered, and they're worried about putting liquid onto bees in cold weather. And I can tell you, I've done this, I think, hundreds, if not thousands of times, and seen really good survival. So it's not something that makes me worried. And it is a really quick application, especially once you get the hang of it. It's also nice to have another beekeeper there. So you can have one beekeeper just hold the boxes and split them open, and then another beekeeper dribbling that solution onto the bees. So it can be really quick, and it's just one other management option that you have in your toolbox for before springtime. We have more information on managing Varroa on the website. So looking at why bees die from Varroa, how to monitor for Varroa mites, and different management options. The Honeybee Health Coalition's Tools for Varroa Management Guide has lots of options and goes through the different considerations for all the different treatment options. And then it's also available in Spanish. So if you're prefer to access information in Spanish, or you know someone else who does, you can check out the translated version from the Honeybee Health Coalition. And that MSU Extension and Honeybee Health Coalition were able to work together for funding to provide the Spanish translation. All right, you should find a program evaluation survey at the end of this webinar. And we get some grants to do some of our different projects and programs. So we're thankful to those. And then now we're going to answer questions. So we're excited to see what you all have on, what you're all thinking about right now.
All right, so I'll go back to the beginning. There were a couple that were when Dan was talking about drone eviction. So the question is, would drone eviction only be adult drones, or would that include the drone larva at this time? Dan, are you able to take that one?
Yeah. So they will get in if yes, they will evict the, well, I don't know if they're evicting, they're not fully formed yet, but yeah, they will pull out developing drone larva pupa especially if there's a really like hard stop to resources coming in. Like if you have an early frost and there's just all of a sudden they went from food coming in to nothing overnight. yeah, the bees, they'll stop investing resources in raising drones. They'll get rid of the existing and they'll stop those that are in the process. So you sometimes will see pulled out. Usually they're in the pupal stage when they pull them out and throw them in front of the hive as well. So yeah, the multiple stages, not just the adults.
Yeah, that's a good question. And we just today did a study where we're looking at every frame that's in a colony as it goes into winter, which I do not recommend during robbing season. It was not fun. But I learned a lot, and we definitely still saw that all of the hives still had brood right now, but we didn't see any drone brood in any of them. So they maybe will remove it, but they also, as Dan mentioned, have stopped raising it mainly. Dan, there's another question on your topic of when they should put on mouse screens.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably put mine on at some point in October. I'm not as worried about it right now while we're still pretty warm temperatures because the bees are active and the bees can kind of police their own space. Like they're occupying that lower part of the lower box. It's once we get into that cooler period where, you know, if you have, you know, cool days and the bees aren't breaking cluster, the population is reduced a little, and there's a, you know, lower half of that bottom box doesn't have bees in it. That's when a mouse could kind of be in there without being evicted. So I typically get around to it at some point in October. I don't have a hard date, but you know, I'd say a little earlier is probably better than a little later. Just be mindful of, you know, if we had a warm stretch coming, we were going to have some high 80s or something anomaly temperatures in early October. I probably wouldn't put them on right before that. But again, I think some point in October. That's what I do.
You don't want to trap the mice inside the hives.
True.
Yeah.
I have done that. All right. There's a question. It says, I heard that you could switch the entrance reducer side to side to calm the bees down. Is there any truth in that?
I can answer that. I haven't heard that before. I don't know that. I think that would just annoy the bees. The more you poke at their entrance, they don't love that sometimes because that's where the guard bees are defending. So we normally, when we put the entrance reducer in, we're going to use that larger entrance setting. There's normally like a smaller, maybe 1-inch size, and that's a size that we don't use for full size colonies. But once the entrance reducer is in, I leave it in all winter until springtime. We don't switch sides.
Yeah, I haven't heard that either. I do have to say, so today when we had so much robbing after our work in the hives, we used the very fancy entrance reducer of just picking up handfuls of grass and shoving it in the entrances. And that also worked very well. And the price was right. It may be that, yeah, I don't know that it would calm them down at all. I think it would just confuse them. Zachary, do you want to talk about a good sugar, 1-to-1 sugar water making method? Oh, you're on mute still.
1-to-1 is actually pretty easy, but that's not the correct ratio for right now. So you want to use 1-to-1 in the spring to simulate the nectar flow, and that stimulates egg laying by the queen. So right now, what you're supposed to do is to actually use 2-to-1, which is more difficult. So I usually just use a pot if it's at home. I heat up the water probably till 60, 70 degrees Celsius, and then put the sugar in, and then turn the heat to very low, and then keep stirring until the sugars are dissolved, and then you let it cool and then use it. So definitely need to heat it, because if you use cold water, you're not going to get 2-to-1 sugar in. 1-to-1, if it's in the springtime, it's much easier. If you could just use hot water when you turn all the way to hot at home, and that's hot enough to dissolve 1-to-1 sugar to get it in probably in 5 or 10 minutes if you keep stirring. But 2-to-1, you have to heat it.
And then there is another question, it says I'd like definitely more information on the plastic inner cover, how it came to be about and how it came to be made. I honestly don't know where you can purchase it. And I was trying to think, I saw this question come in and I was trying to think of what is an equivalent level plastic, and I really can't think of one. They were definitely quite flexible. You could see you could kind of peel them back. And I think the idea behind them was that you could take the lid off and kind of peek down in without disturbing the colony. I could tell you that that didn't work very well. Like it didn't feel like that was a huge advantage to have them. But they were perfectly fine to use. I can ask the people in Sweden if they had more information about what type of plastic it was.
I saw the same thing in Germany, and it's pretty thick.
Yeah, it's definitely
probably,
still flexible. It's to date myself, it's thicker than like a transparency sheet.
yeah,
But it's soft.
Yeah.
So I don't know what type of plastic it is. Maybe I have to go to Home Depot. Maybe I'll see what they have.
Yeah, I don't understand quite how that could help the colony. In my first instinct is it's going to keep all the moisture inside, but they were using it in the summer, and it basically seals it, the whole thing.
Yeah, it makes it tight. It seals it totally tight across. I should say that too, because they propolize the sides, so it is sealed pretty tight on the top. And one of the reasons that it definitely wasn't impressive enough that I wanted to switch to it, but I thought it was so interesting because it's so profoundly different than the messaging that I was always told of like quilt boxes and upper entrances. And then you've got people that are in an equally cold climate being like, oh no, it's hard plastic sealed tight is what you want at the top. And then I did put Bill Hesbach's thing, and he wants a little air gap and have the heat reflected down as well. So the next question, it says,
I'll just add to that. Sorry. We have a couple of comments in the Q&A. So some people use clear shower curtains or greenhouse plastic. So I don't know if either.
Yeah, those would be, thanks, Matt. Also, Matt, I still think you came in too late to see one. It was definitely a little stiffer than both of those, but I feel like that would be the same, basically the same thing. And so there is another question that says, should I close the upper entrance in the winter? And that first word of the should, I feel like so I know people who have upper entrances who have very good survival, who feel very strongly about having an upper entrance, and that's a perfectly good practice. I also know people, like we say, like in Europe, where they close that top tight, or the condensing colony where you close the top tight, who also have very good survival. So the upper entrance is not going to be the thing that makes or breaks your colony. I can say that probably in my hives, about half of them have upper entrances, just because the spacers that are on there haven't been propolized shut, and the other half propolized them shut and they don't. And I don't feel strongly about changing them either way. So this is one where, to quote Win Harless, the bees don't care on that one. All right. On the sugar bricks, I believe where this came in, or maybe on the mountain camp, Zachary, where you have the newspaper and then the sugar, they ask if parchment paper can be used instead of newspaper.
I think newspaper would be easier. The problem was a wax paper would be going to insulate the sugar from the moisture. So then the sugar is going to cake too slowly. And it's also more difficult for the bees to chew through that paper. If parchment paper is the same as wax paper at home, you're definitely going to insulate the moisture from the sugar. So your sugar would take much longer to cake up. So I would say stay with newspaper. You need to have the moisture being able to penetrate the paper, whereas the parchment paper is not going to do that.
All right, and then still on feeding, there's kind of two that are related. So one says, how much sugar syrup for one hive? Is it 1 gallon, 2 gallons, or more?
The Dan question.
Yeah, Dan, do you want to go ahead with that one?
Yeah, so I can say some of our bees have already had 5 or 6, and we'll probably get 1 or 2 more. And they're just in areas where there's nothing, they don't bring anything in after about the 1st of August. So they'll end up getting 7 or 8, and there's others that still have supers on that'll come off this week, and they've got heavy brood nests, and they might get 1 gallon because it'll make me feel better, but they probably don't need it. So I'd say somewhere between 0 and 10, but yeah, it's just really situation dependent, and getting to know, better to err on the side of too much. Like, there's no coming back from starvation. As you learn in beekeeping, you'll get a sense of what you need to get through winter and how much they consume. But again, their consumption is going to vary from severity and duration of winter, size of colony, genetics, a lot of different things. So when in doubt, I kind of think if you have to ask yourself, probably give it to them. If you think they're too light, if you have to ask the question, the answer is probably yes. But I'd say on average for our bees, they'll probably end up getting 3 to 4 gallons each. But again, that's a wide range, yard to yard and hive to hive.
Basically, it really depends on how much you already have in the hive. So the target is probably having between 65 to 80 pounds of honey. So if you already have a super there, then you don't need to have 4 gallons. So if you have nothing, if you store all their honey off, just having food boxes left, and then of course you need to feed much more. So really, some people can have a beehive and tell how much weight it is, or you could just lift. If you're not good at that, you can just lift each super and then feel the weight, and then have an idea how much is in that. Because bees and brood doesn't weigh much, so whatever is weighing will be the honey. So before, after you feed the syrup, you should be able to tell how much weight you have. Because you don't want to feed like 120 pounds and that be overdoing it. But also you don't want to have a colony going into the winter with 40 pounds of honey, and that's going to be too short. And feeding, dry sugar in January is not going to be fun. So that should happen only 1 out of 10 colonies, not all of your colonies, because you'll be walking in the snow and opening them up. And, yeah.
Yeah, so as Dan mentioned, it depends on the yard of where food comes in. As Zachary's mentioned, it depends on how heavy they are by this time of year. So if they're already really heavy, you maybe feed 0. If they're light, you'll feed a lot. I'm going to add one more thing that it depends on, which is also a thing you can watch. It's just what the weather's going to be like over the next 2 months. So we've basically have shut down with the majority of the honey flow. Now, even the secondary honey flow, everything's tapering off. If it stays really warm, the bees are still going to be active. They'll go through a lot of food. If it got to be 45 degrees tomorrow and stayed 45 degrees until March, they're going to go through much less food. So if we have that beautiful, like 60, 70, 80 degrees all the way through October, you may need to feed a lot more. And that goes into the second question, which I'll start on and then people can comment on, is when you would stop feeding. And they said they've been feeding too long and the honey was not drying going into cold temperatures. And so we're feeding right now, knowing that we've got a couple really nice weeks, or at least a nice long-term forecast for most of Michigan, which I know even from the UP right now is nice. And so we've got a couple of weeks where they can actually take food in, dry it down. But then later you're maybe feeding not with the intent of having them dry it and store it and cap it. But like I said, if it's 60 degrees or 80 degrees in October, you maybe want to feed them just so they don't use their stores, because they'll use that liquid feed faster. But it is a really good consideration that you want to start feeding pretty early. So we talked about it in the last couple ones that, you know, we're all kind of paying attention to either goldenrod is feeding or you're feeding. So that's kind of like August through early September in Michigan. And then you would continue kind of debate based on whether or not it's heavy now and whether or not it's going to be warm moving forward. So I don't know if anyone wants to add to that about when to kind of stop it. All right, so there's a couple questions on the oxalic acid drip. So someone's asking for a link, which if I stop talking, I'll look up one.
I have a good link too. I'm adding
Okay.
now.
So Vanna wants to add that in the chat. And then there's a question that says, oh, perfect. What outdoor temperature do you need before doing the OA drip?
So I don't believe the label specifies for the solution method, but I would normally we're applying it when the temps are like in the 40s. So they're loosely clustered, but it's not really super cold. So like we don't open them up when it's 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But I would say I like to apply it personally when it's in the 40s degree Fahrenheit as like a ballpark.
Yeah, loose cluster. Okay, so now on the Varroa thing, there's a couple questions. So someone about Varroa monitoring. So someone said they're using the CO2 injector, or they purchased the CO2 injector to check for mites. They read it's easy to use, but they don't know how effective. And then someone said that they read that the sugar-covered bees die after you do the sugar roll method of mite detection. So should you actually do the alcohol wash? Anna, do you want to talk about alcohol versus sugar versus CO2?
I'll talk about alcohol versus sugar, and then someone else can chime in with CO2. So both those methods we find to be fine. If you're open to using the alcohol wash, there's some ways that sometimes it has fewer errors or issues, especially in the spring. Sometimes the powdered sugar roll test, if there's a lot of nectar that gets into that sample, sometimes the powdered sugar kind of melts on the bees, so it's not as good. But either way, we have videos on how to do them. And as long as you're monitoring, both of them are normally going to be good enough for just kind of monitoring your honeybee colonies. But the alcohol wash is a little bit more accurate than the powdered sugar roll test.
And there's another question about the CO2 as well, if they actually survive the process.
I haven't used it, so I can't speak to that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've used
CO2. I have done experiments to put bees into a bag and CO2 them for as long as half an hour inside a Ziploc bag, where the bag was puffed. Wait for 30 minutes. They still wake up. Well, almost no mortality because the insects have adaptations to cope with CO2. They just cover the shell of the spiracles, so they stop the CO2 from moving in and survive on basically a low metabolism state. So I haven't tried 1 hour or two. I think half an hour is no problem. But we'll die in 5 minutes.
They won't die in 5 minutes, but we did do that study because we did publish a paper on this, you and I, Zachary, like 10 years ago, about how the bees that did get knocked out with CO2 ended up having less survival, but that was like after 20 days or something. So it did affect their survival a little bit. And we do use CO2 to knock out queens after instrumental insemination too. Yeah. So I don't know that it's perfect, but also, you're doing a handful of workers. Someone said that when they tried the CO2, they actually blew the bees around the container that they were in.
It's because your carbon dioxide can is high pressurized, so it's going to blow.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a thing that works. I think whatever makes you go out and actually do the monitoring is the best one. Dish soap also works quite well as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I just said they will wake up, but they also probably have a shortened longevity because CO2 will make bees forage earlier and that will in turn in summer. So if you carbon dioxide newly emerged bees for 5 minutes, and those bees are going to start foraging maybe 3 days earlier than untreated bees, and that translates into 3 days shorter lifetime. So I was just speaking about waking up, being able
mhm,
to not die right away. Yeah.
mhm. Um, all right. So there's a couple questions on nukes, which I'll take unless other people can chime in. So it says, do you dribble oxalic acid in November in the nukes? I do tend to do that. The nukes do get oxalic acid dribble, but I would say I probably do it a little earlier, like in October, but that's just a convenience situation for me. I'm just tired by November. And then there's a question about what should a healthy 5-frame nuke look like before going into winter. So I don't have a ton of nukes, 5-frame nukes going into winter right now, but I just checked them yesterday. And the thing that I was doing with them yesterday was making sure that they were pretty full on food. So what I did, so they all had a tiny bit of brood, and I left the frames that had brood on it alone. But I usually put in an outside frame that has like room for them to grow. And some years they just fill it up and are chock full and like totally full at this time of year. And this year I went out yesterday when I went out, and the outside project frame was hardly full on them. Like it just had a little bit of nectar. So what I did is I swapped it out. I had a really big starter that, excuse me, that had a ton of capped honey from earlier in the year. And I swapped it out. So at least there's a full frame that's like wall to wall, fully capped honey in there. So at this time of year, I'm hoping they start to get a little clogged up. So they still all have a little bit of brood in there, but not a ton. And then they should start be actually getting pretty full of honey. I'm using the polystyrene nukes, and so I am going to feed them. And after just noticing that they weren't putting a ton away, and I'll just pour some sugar syrup in the bottom and let them pull that up off the bottom there. Zachary, there's a flower question. Someone says they have a lot of white aster in my area. Does it still provide a good nectar flow for winter food stores?
Yes, those are fall aster. They typically bloom for about 2 weeks before frost, and some say they will not produce much nectar until frost hits them. But I have seen bees forage on them now. So, but the thing is, by the time frost hits, there's not going to be a lot of foraging force in the colony to really give you much nectar flow as an influx of nectar for your winter feed. So basically, if you don't have enough food now, you need to feed them, not counting on goldenrod or aster, because it's going to be so little amount of flow. And you will not make a super box on that for aster. From now on, goldenrod is basically done, so the aster will be on. But the amount of aster flowers, amount of nectar, and the amount of forager bees working on it basically says it's negligible for your colony.
All right. This next question, I am going to give a solid I don't know to. So I'm going to read it and then everybody else can. So it says, when hygienic bees chew out a diseased pupa, do they actually ingest the parts, or do they just tear it apart and discard them? What is the threat posed by ingested viruses if they eat them? So I can definitely say I have seen chewed pupa bits outside of the hive. But that doesn't mean that I don't know that they don't also. Dan unmuted, so hopefully you have some.
I'm in my prime. I wouldn't say I don't definitively know they don't eat them, But when we do hygienic testing, you can almost guess how well they did by looking outside the entrance and seeing how much is discarded of those pupa that you've deliberately killed. So I think my thought would be primarily they're getting discarded, they're not getting eaten. As far to as the contagiousness, spreading virus, that I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I don't know.
Well, and that I feel a little more confident. So some of the viruses that are in the hive that are Varroa associated are not necessarily new viruses. Well, so specifically deformed wing viruses are not new to our bees, and historically they've been transmitted more mouth to mouth. And so they can be sexually transmitted, they can be vertically transmitted, and they are mouth to mouth. So they were like more standard viruses. They became much worse or much more virulent when they're injected. So sometimes it's like when we don't have the Varroa mites, it's not necessarily that the mites aren't, or that the viruses aren't in there. It's a lot of times that they're just not going through the more dangerous pathway. There's a lot of viruses that are like, some of the worst viruses are the ones that come through vector-borne pathways. So they could be still getting the viruses from the bees that they're removing, but they maybe aren't necessarily going to be as devastating as when they're vector-borne compared to when they remove them. But now I kind of want to see if they're actually eating them at the same time too.
I just sent everyone a paper that the title was Pupal Cannibalism by Worker Bees.
Oh, there we go.
Contributes to the spread of deformed wing virus. So bees do eat they do eat part of the pupae. And probably, yeah, also larvae if they're trying to clean the hive. And that's how American foulbrood gets spread. So they're trying to clean that stuff, but they get the spores over their body, and it's just a habit trying to lick a little bit when they're cleaning and tasting herbs.
Yeah, we talk about that for European foulbrood too. I mean, like hygienically, they call them hygienic bees, but like when you're removing disease things with your mouth, that's like that's like a public health nightmare. That's like the least hygienic behavior that you could do, really. Oh yeah, this paper is perfect, Zachary. Thank you. All right, there's a queen question coming up. I have a hive that was queen right on August 12th with eggs and capped brood, but last week inspection, there were queens, but no eggs and no capped brood. No supersedure cells, good population of bees. Could she have stopped laying due to the time of year? Or is there possibly an issue with the queen? She was in the bottom box, mostly pollen and honey. Added frames with drawn comb to see if the issue was no room to lay. Any takers?
I have to say it's not normal. That should be, I mean, the queen is starting to shut down. But a lot of my colonies a week ago, I still found 5 frames of capped brood, a lot of eggs, a lot of larvae. So if they suddenly shut off, something's wrong with that queen family. Because it's not that cold now. During the day, it's quite warm. It's cool.
Well, and I don't know where this person is too, but
okay, this is not just in Michigan.
No, we have people from all over the place. That's what we should do on our next poll, is see where people are from.
Yeah,
Anna,
They do tell us in the poll. They do tell us.
yeah. If you're in Alaska, maybe this is normal. Or Sweden. Yeah.
Anna, you unmuted. Did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was gonna say you should take this one because you were looking for brood all day long in colonies.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw, so we did have colonies that didn't have eggs necessarily. But we definitely saw capped brood and everything. And it would be pretty surprising that they shut down. So there is the weather thing. There's also is a genetic component, and there's also an age component. And some people, if you talk to, will talk about like a diseased state component. So if the colony has a lot of diseased pupa, they maybe will continue to lay longer, but it feels quite early. If it is in, you know, central Michigan, it does feel quite early that she would have, because basically to not have any capped brood by now means she stopped 21 days ago.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, was still pretty warm there. So, but I mean, it's either fine or it's not. You know, there's not much you can do at this time of year besides combining it if you just wanted to add those workers. But if I wouldn't recommend like requeening or trying to buy, you know, buy a nuke or something. You're just basically just gonna recombine it. So I would just see what happens if it was mine. Someone asks, do you tilt the hive boxes for the winter? So I have solid boards, and what I've ended up doing is just drilling a small hole in the back of the boards. So that if there is a lot of rain or moisture that comes in, it can drain out the back, because my hives are at every which angle. If you have screen bottom boards, you don't really have to tilt them, or if you have a drainage hole in the back, you don't have to tilt them. Otherwise, it is nice practice if you've got that nice big landing board out the front to tilt them a little bit forward so that water will rain out of the front. I have lost one hive to moisture for sure, and I hadn't noticed that I parked it underneath the like downspout on a barn, and it basically just filled, and they had propolized the bottom, and it was tilted backwards, and there was about 6 inches of water in the bottom. So don't do that. But all right. And then someone asks, is the bottom entrance the only entrance? So yes, in a lot of the hives that we saw in Europe, and then in a lot of my hives, the bottom entrance is the only entrance. I did get really excited, like in 2011 or something, it was popular to do only top entrances. That was Michael Bush. And I thought it was very clever because then I wouldn't have to mow anymore. So that's another option, but then you have to think about like the entrance was moving up and down all the time. So there's a question about feeding. Oh, if you have the plastic. So do you cut a hole in the plastic for liquid feeding, or what about dry feeding? How would this work? So they were using top feeders, and they took the plastic off and put it on top of the top feeder. So it's basically the same as an inner cover that wouldn't have a hole in it, or like when people use canvas for an inner cover or something like that. So when they were feeding, they would take off the plastic. They also, I mean, they had this really nice system where you could actually buy pre-filled honey buckets, and you just removed the label and it covered all of the feeder holes, and you would just buy a 2-gallon bucket of liquid syrup and put it right on top, which I really wish that we had. All right, and then if someone can feed the bees fondant and the probiotics, the super DFM instead. So I'm guessing the fondant you're talking about instead of this, so this would be a winter feed. So that's maybe instead of the sugar bricks or something like that. But yes, you can feed fondant in the winter, and then you could add things if you want to add things. All right, someone said they had their hive swarm for the second time this year. I have 2 deeps on and a honey super. They just pulled a honey super earlier in the year, but took 8 frames and put another super on with 2 frames of honey. Is that normal? We had someone capture and take the swarm. What should I do for my hive to make it through the winter? Anna, do you want to do this one?
Sure. So let me just kind of recap. So you have, so I think the 2 questions here with this colony that swarmed twice are, 1, like, what is the population size? And 2, does it have enough food? Is that, am I getting the gist here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think, so, you know, like, hopefully, even though it swarmed twice, you're checking it has a laying queen, you're finding that there's brood. And so you're kind of also looking at that colony, that population of bees. And if it's really small, they're going to go through less food than if they're a larger kind of standard size colony. But if you're putting on back, like if you had put any supers back on the hive that were foundation, or any boxes in with foundation, you know, that's not something that, especially at this time of year, we're not expecting bees to draw new comb. You want to make sure that they have drawn comb that has honey in it. if you're seeing a lot of empty comb in the hive, you should be feeding heavy syrup this time of year. So especially colonies that swarmed or weren't really on track the whole year might be kind of light on food, and so feeding them might help.
All right, and then someone's asking about the vaporizing method for oxalic acid. So we talked a lot about the dribble. And one of the reasons we like to teach the dribble is it's a lot harder to kill yourself with it, basically. It's much safer to work with. The vaporizer method does work well. It is a labeled way to use it. So one thing is you do have to have the appropriate equipment. And there are data that show that having something that the actual temperature is important. So it's not just that it heats up, but it is whether or not you can control the temperature. So having one of the devices that is temperature controlled is important. But the other thing is you do have to wear a respirator, and you want to take the PPE very seriously with that, because inhaling the oxalic acid vapors are very dangerous for you. Again, this is definitely something that is a preference thing. And when we do these talks, a lot of what we're doing is just saying, like, here's what we do in our hives. I've tried both, and I have a strong preference for the dribble just because for me, with as many hives as we do, it's faster. But that doesn't mean that the other one is wrong. It's a perfectly fine, acceptable practice. Just make sure take the PPE seriously with that one. All right. So with screen bottom boards, do you leave them open in the winter or place the insert? Anna, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, I would place the insert in just to prevent some of the airflow, and especially if it's in a windy location.
Yep. And then the last one says, my hives face north. Should I redirect them for winter? I keep losing my hives in this yard, but no others have been lost. It could be the north facing if there's a ton of wind that's going directly into the entrances. Another thing that could be yard dependent, I mean, as Dan mentioned earlier, is different yards have very different food resources, but also different yards have very different Varroa risks. And I'm going to so there's a paper that we have that that Kelly wrote that looks at robbing screens and Varroa mites and talks about how much Varroa comes in from your neighbor's bees. And that's actually some conversations I had with phone calls with people today too, is, when you're doing Varroa control, you're managing what's in your own hives throughout the summer. But at this time of year, we're also really concerned about what's in the, 3-mile radius around our colonies. So they can also have different risks. So it could be the north facing part. That being said, I have hives that face all of the directions, but none of them are in very, very windy areas. That being said, one year I couldn't get them out of a hayfield in time, and I had a bunch of them in a super windy area, and most of those were fine too. As long as the wind's not going, whipping directly right through the hive. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Yeah, and I would say also, instead of just like rotating your hives, if you are worried about being in a windy location, you could also just make a windbreak and do some bales of hay or straw to break the wind.
Yeah, good point. All right, that's the end. We made it through the Q&A. So we always seem to end right around 8:30. It's like that's the end of us. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for listening and for joining us for this month. And we look forward to talking to you at a bunch of the events coming up in October. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Have a good night.